Good morning and welcome to this third lecture for the Understanding Business for Analysts module. Today we're talking about how we make sense of problems through framing and structuring. So my first part of content will lead on directly from the reading that you had this week as we consider puzzles, problems and messes. This will lead us nicely into thinking about problem frames and perspectives, and then I will introduce problem structuring methods and show you a few of the problem structuring methods tools. So let's begin now with a modeller's perspective. This, as you might expect, is a technically focused perspective, defining problems according to their formulation and solution in order to differentiate three types. We might think of many analytics problems as puzzles, but where, for example, we might need to define the objective function or clarify constraints of the problem, this framework would categorize that situation as a problem, a situation in which the solution is arguable. This is then further contrasted with the situation where the formulation of the problem is arguable, but so is the solution. And PID would suggest, as I hope you've picked up from your reading, that in this type of situation where we have an arguable formulation and an arguable solution, that's where we might need the support of a facilitator. Okay, so here we have an example. Oh, gone on too far. Far too far. Here is an example that we've met previously, the algebra system. So I'd like you to think about this example and decide for me whether you feel that this is a puzzle, a problem, or a mess. And because we're in the smart stage, I have Josh to help me to set you up a poll. I'll just give you a couple of moments to look through that example. Okay, so if we can have a poll now then, please, Josh. So I'd like you to tell me whether you think that this is A, a puzzle, B, a problem, or C, a mess. Okay, so obviously we've got nothing in D because I've not given you a category for that. But here we are, we've got some variation here. And I wonder if a couple of you that have voted now might like to enter into our chat why you feel that either the formulation, solution, or both are arguable or, in contrast, agreed. Just a few comments. Oh my goodness, I wonder who's put D. We might need a chat about that later. So if I encourage you there to type a few words into the chat if you feel able about why you believe that this is a puzzle, a problem, or a mess. I think perhaps people are a little bit sleepy this morning. Oh, okay. Arthur is saying to us, yes, B, the cause of the problem could be attributed to the customer base of 20% being traditional and older. I'm guessing you mean generation there, Arthur. The solution is arguable as there is a universal solution to tackle the issue. I think perhaps you mean that there isn't a universal solution, or maybe that there is a standard solution that needs to be in some way bespoke to respond to that customer base. But yes, there is no universal solution to tackle the issue. Thank you. Okay. So let's move on then. Perhaps some of you would like to have a further think about that and come up with some arguments for what type of problem we thought it was going to be. But PID says that problem framing or problem setting, what we do when we formulate problems, enables us to see some things and to miss or ignore others. And we're going to jump right into exploring frames and perspectives with a brief video. Okay. There we are, problem frames and perspectives, and if we play the video now. Okay, so there we saw the same actor portraying 6 different characters, and we saw the tagline at the end that the picture is created more by the person behind the camera than the person in front of it. So what was confusing, what was insightful? I'm hoping that you might be able to type one word into the chat. So just one word to describe how we construct frames based upon or inspired by this clip. And whilst you work on your one words, I want to pick up on the fact that whilst the video was playing, we did get some more responses there around algebra. So we've got arguments that the situation is actually a mess because of the challenges it faces being complex and interconnected, not just about upgrading the customer relationship management system, inefficiency, poor customer experience. I'm not going to pick out all of those, but I'm going to move on to the next one. Thank you, Josh. So solving this situation requires more than just a technical fix. It demands some organizational alignment, process redesign, and strategic change. Quite big changes. Indicating there in this person's view that Algebar's case is a mess. Okay, so we have two opinions expressed in there, that the one that it's a problem, the other that it might be a mess. Some of you also voted saying it was actually a puzzle, something where, you know, the solution was not arguable. So there's something to think about there, isn't there, in the way that we have perceived that case differently as individuals. Okay, so to come back to the video clip then, we're thinking about, you know, how do we construct our frames? How do we describe the way that we construct our frames? You guys have said perspective, position, view, preconception. That was one of the words used in the video, I think, wasn't it? Opinion, perspective again, preconceived notion, outlook, multi-perspectivity. Yeah, if you're thinking about the difference between what those different photographers came up with. The biases, yes, that's feeding into the way that we perceive things. Insight into the person, the differences, the individual perspectives. Yeah, all of these words are reassuring me that you guys are ready for the next slide. So here, my next slide. Colin Eden, who produced this diagram a long time ago now, Colin was the original developer of one of the main problem structuring methods. And he saw cognition as the interaction between a value system and a belief system. And this was drawing upon Kelly's personal construct theory. So a theory that comes from the field of psychology. And here we see events resulting in a selective perception. As PID might say, we've seen some things and we've missed others. Based upon what we've perceived, we construe or make sense of what we've been seeing. So what do we believe about millionaires or convicts or alcoholics? This impacts how we define the situation. How does our value system influence how we choose to portray millionaires or convicts or alcoholics? This impacts how we define the problem as we seek to represent that person on camera. So let's revisit then our other reading, which referred to Einstein. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. So, does this suggest that the problem or the solution should take priority? At the very least, perhaps we begin to think that analytics is about more than code and hard sums. I would suggest also that if a frame enables us to see some things, but not others, we might also consider whether we're happy with a single perspective model or whether we might want to develop multi-perspective models. Hold that thought as we move on to think about PSMs. So here we are, beginning to talk about PSMs. The principles and characteristics of PSMs then. PSMs are practical, creative, and visual. They're supporting a productive and inclusive dialogue in which people participate. They allow the expression of multiple perspectives, and that deepens our insight into the situation, so that having shared and explored those perspectives, we're able to come up with a wider range of ideas and proposal. They tend to be visual, in part because they're used in live collaborative development of output. They're constantly on display, and we're referring to them within the stakeholder dialogue. We are deliberately taking time over this. We're making space and avoiding the temptation to make a snap decision whilst we just focus on exploring that situation. We're thinking about wholes, so we're considering the big picture, which helps us to avoid the pitfall of solving one problem or one part of the problem only to fall foul of another. You might remember that when I talked about wicked problems last week, I talked about my favourite academic quote, one of my favourite academic quotes, of wicked problems being like the head of a hydra. You cut off one head, two more sprout, your problem has just become more difficult to deal with. So we don't want to solve one part of the problem to fall foul of another part. However, we must address the boundaries or scope of our intentions. Those of you familiar with project management will have heard the term scope creep, when suddenly there are expectations that your project is going to deliver things that were not in that original scope, that were not originally agreed, not originally planned for, given resources for. So this idea of thinking about the whole is important, but then so too is the placing of boundaries around what it is we're intending to change or attempting to improve. Finally then, and I'm hoping this will be no surprise at this point, we're looking to externalize the worldviews. We're stepping back from our own worldviews in order to build multiple perspective models. So what happens in a PSM intervention? Oops, sorry. The origins, sorry. So PSMs were designed, they were intended to help us engage with messy or wicked problems. And whilst this may prompt you to feel that they're not that relevant to people whose focus and interest relates to puzzles and problems, they can also be very helpful when you're looking at the arguable solution space of a problem. So PSMs are non-optimizing. We're looking at acceptable solutions. We have reduced data demands, and yet we are trying to integrate hard and soft data, often qualitative data, and social judgments, opinions, subjectivity. They tend to be aimed at being simple and transparent to clarify the terms of conflict, but another benefit of that simplicity and transparency is that we try often with PSMs to be achieving procedural justice, that people are able to see when and how they're able to contribute to the framing of the problem. They treat people as active subjects. Yes, so I've talked, haven't I, about how people participate. The models are visually displayed. So it's not the case that you provide some data and an analyst goes into a back office, does some hard sums and produces a model that they then have to explain to you how it works. You're seeing the model being built in real time, and you're participating in the building of that model. And therefore, it's facilitating planning from the bottom up. I'm a little less comfortable with this last point here, that the idea is that it accepts uncertainty and aims to keep options open for later resolution. We can't always do that. There comes a point that we have to be making a decision. So that's the one I'm personally a little bit less comfortable with. But I think it does point in the direction of suggesting that there needs to be accommodation, acceptance sometimes of other people's views, accommodation, and perhaps some compromise around what is agreed, and the level of risk that you have to accept you're taking if you decide to act in the face of uncertainty. So, as part of my PhD research, I produced this model, and Josh, do you mind putting it flat so that thank you. Thank you. Just because it's a little bit awkward to see those lines on the angled screen. So I built this model to describe what a typical PSM intervention might look like. We see those multiple stakeholders engaging in real world problems. I've got the circle over to the left there that is showing the people looking at a real world mess. They're engaging in a real world problem. And they're doing that, if you move over to the little light bulb, they're seeking to identify and make desirable and feasible improvements within the situation. When we say desirable, it may be different things are desirable to different people. And when we talk about feasibility, referencing back to that idea of multiple stakeholders, one of our key concerns is the political feasibility. Are people going to agree and fully commit to the changes that we want to make? When we're working with a PSM, we are designing a staged analysis that is formally planned and documented. That's in a large part where that procedural justice comes from. And if you think about that staged analysis being designed, you might think back to some of the things we talked about last week as we discussed the phases of intervention. The work that you do at the outset to understand the context, to appreciate the situation prior to undertaking the analysis, doing any assessment work, which may also bring in, a bit of a review amongst those stakeholders, and supporting ultimately, we hope, the commitment to act. So the piece that I've missed out there is this idea of building models in a facilitated environment. And this is where the live building of the model is important. And another model diagram that I produced during the course of my research was looking at the general stages. So when we work as a facilitator using PSMs, we are trying to elicit information from people. We are trying to get them to share. So that means we need to be careful about how we ask questions. We want always to be approachable. And ideally, we want to be offering multiple input opportunities for any people that are in any way feeling anxious about participating. Perhaps they don't trust us yet. Offering multiple opportunities can be helpful. We're then representing that information that we're gaining from participants, and we're modeling in real time. So we need to have a firm knowledge of the technique and a knowledge of any software that we're using to support our modeling, because we're on view as we're doing that. People can see it if we're not slick in our use of the tools. Now, I've talked today quite a lot about multiple perspectives and the importance of trying to model multiple perspectives. In some PSMs, that representation shows multiple perspectives in the same model that we view at the same time. In others, you have multiple representations, but you're not viewing them in a single frame. You have to switch and compare the different models. And that's just the different ways that PSMs have developed over time. You're then using those models to generate the questions. I've used that word, haven't I? Comparing what's coming up there. So you're exploring the models and the understandings that different people have of the situation that you're trying to represent. And you use that to support a constructive dialogue and group dynamic. Academics will talk and researchers will talk of boundary objects, using the model as a boundary object, so that it is less confrontational to be questioning something that is represented in the model rather than going into direct conflict with an opinion or a view that has been expressed by another member of the group. Finally then, this constructive dialogue and this constructive group dynamic is intended to support negotiation. And when you have a strong negotiation, you hope that everybody is committed then to the outcome. So you're assessing the potential impacts of going in different directions, of taking different options forward. And then you're supporting this dialogue about the desirability and feasibility of those solutions and options. This again brings us back to thinking, how politically feasible is this? To whom is this desirable? And to whom might this actually be undesirable? Okay, so I'm hoping that gives you then that piece to fill in this idea that we're building models in a facilitated environment, that's very much a live environment for the facilitator to be working directly with the participants. Okay, so here then, I have some examples of problem structuring methods, and this is where this lecture is a bit of a challenge really, because we could have an entire 10-week model about soft systems methodology, similarly about SOJA journey making, strategic choice approach, or viable systems model. These are four of the very big, well-established, often used problem structuring methods. I've also got up here some examples of some of the activities and the considerations that practitioners will be thinking about. We've already covered quite comprehensively the stakeholder management, so we won't talk very much about that. But you can appreciate, I'm sure, how when you're working with these multiple participants, they are all stakeholders. They all have some vested interest in the situation you're looking at. We think also about the contextual analysis. What analysis supports our initial understanding of the situation? How do we structure and frame that? I've talked about how you might use different tools at different stages of interventions. And Mingus is an academic who's written a lot about how you might take tools from different PSMs and combine them together in a bespoke staged analysis for a specific intervention, a specific situation. I've also talked through quite comprehensively this idea of facilitated model building and what it looks like in practice. Okay, so stakeholder analysis we talked about last week. I'm going to attempt in the next half hour to talk about PID's idiot questions, rich pictures, and CATWO. I also have some material about causal mapping, which we will attempt in the workshops this afternoon. I've included that material as an appendix because I may or may not be able to get to that this morning. So let's move ahead here. So the idea of PID's idiot questions is based upon Kipling's wise men. Okay, so I keep 6 honest working men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. So these, based upon these questions, the what, why, when, how, where, who, PID has developed these idiot questions. I prefer to call them the sort of wise men questions myself, because I spend an awful lot of time saying to students, there is no such thing as a stupid question. And as a facilitator, any question that a participant raises has meaning for them. So I do have slight problems with that naming there. However, PID is asking, when he's looking at a situation, what is going on and what do people want? Why have we become involved? Why does the client want help? When did this start? What's the history of all that's been going on here? How did it start to emerge within that history? Where is it all happening? Who are the people involved and what do we know about them? You'll notice here that I've got some text in blue. And this represents where your questions don't have to be just seeking, they can be slightly challenging. So in addition to saying, where is all of this happening? Peter's saying, and does it have to happen here? Could it happen somewhere else? Could it happen slightly differently? So if we apply this to the algebra example, so there's the same information that we had previously, but we're going to flip it on and see, okay, if we structure this around these wise men, what do we come up with? We have the idea that there have been complaints around efficiency, customer experience, and integration. These are a lot of the things that were coming up when I asked you to type in the text about whether you thought this was a puzzle, a problem, or a mess. You were mentioning these things, that there were issues, complaints. There's a definite task, you know, that the CEO has asked the analytics team to explore updating this, presumably because they believe, moving on to this why question, that the analytics team have the skills and knowledge to help. When did this start? Where's it emerging from? The complaints have started it, and it's been realised that these complaints are centering upon lack of integration. Where is it happening? Okay, so it's happening in the marketing team. I think we'll learn a little bit more about that in the next example. Who are the people involved and what do we know about them? Well, I'm sure we could find out some more about these people, but based upon the information we have so far, we have the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and the CTO. We also have the analytics team, the IT team, and we have the users of the customer relationship management system. I would argue that we might also put the customers themselves in there, but perhaps that's intended to be included as part of the users. Okay, so at the moment, this is helpful, I believe, but I wouldn't say it was particularly creative or visual. We've reorganized stuff, but I would like to move on to say, could we look at a different approach that is going to give us something a little bit more visual? And we're going to get that from rich pictures. So they're part of a problem structuring method that is called soft systems methodology. I mentioned it before. It's often used in project work and particularly in IT implementations. SSM gives us tools to explore the real world, but it also encourages us to explore an imaginary conceptual world. So we have tools exploring perceptions of the real world and representing that real world. And then we step over into an imaginary world in which we say, okay, if we're working with that perception, that's understanding of the situation and that set of desires and aspirations around what the system could or should be doing, then in the conceptual world, we build models of that perspective. We then compare the models that we build in the conceptual world with what we're seeing in the real world. And that's the point at which we decide what we might like to change in that real world. Okay, so if we start in the real world then, the rich picture is one of those real world representations. So we step back from the situation to express our views. We're trying to create a single visual reference point. We're exploring multiple explanations, subjectivity, conflict, grey areas. We're trying to represent all of those things in the picture that we produce. And as we talk about these pictures, that's what gives us a shared interpretation. And that interpretation helps us to identify and develop a list of issues. I have a slide here that I don't want to go through in great detail, but I've identified some of the elements of an effective rich picture for you. Yeah, so we're saying it's not about drawing skills. We want to try and use the language of the people involved. We must remember to record that issues list. And And we want to include structure and process, just enough to record the process of the concerns, to show what we want to show in the picture. We don't need all the intricacies. And a hint around including concerns that, you know, these support the expression of the content that we might find in the issues list. It's also an opportunity to use the language of those peoples that are involved. And here we have a rich picture for Algebra. And what do we notice? Well, the first thing that my eye is drawn to when I look at this is the fact that we have this red piece here. We have a lack of integration between the CRM and some of the other systems. And people are unhappy about this. The sales team are unhappy, the marketing team are unhappy, and we can see quite a lot of unhappiness around the customers here in the corner. Senior management team are hearing about this from the analytics team, and they're thinking, we've got our eyes on this customer relations management system. It's not looking quite so good to us. We see some issues here. We're concerned about the efficiency. We're concerned about the integration with the other systems. We're concerned about the customer experience. The analytics team are showing us this bright new world in which actually these systems might be happily integrated. This is what's being represented over here, the happiness and the systems all lined up. What do you guys think? If I look at this picture and I'm thinking about some of these elements of an effective rich picture, you know, it's not about the drawing skills, it's about drawing insights. It's using the language involved, recording an issues list, including some structure enough to be able to share what we need to, and including the concerns. So on that basis, what do we think of this rich picture? If you want to type in the room chat, I can see you've got a question there, Catalina. I'll try and return to that at the end. But for the moment, what do we think of the rich picture? Any thoughts or reflections on the quality? Good things that are there, things that might be expanded a little more. I have a little list of my own, which I will share in a moment if we're not getting too much on the chat. I thought something was happening there. I thought we were getting more content in the chat. Okay, it gives an idea on the energy. Yes. The positive and negative energy, perhaps, and that could link back to giving you some sort of insight. Running one of these activities would certainly help you fill in a sociodynamic energy grid, one of the tools that we talked about last week. Yeah, gives you an idea of the energy. You know, we've got a lot of unhappiness. We could say perhaps so that we want to know a little bit more about how the unhappiness manifests. We can see represented here that there's a belief that it's linked to the lack of integration. But, you know, how do these frustrations manifest? What is the implication of that lack of integration? There's a view that it's fairly straightforward with a clear indication of where the gap is. It shows the emotion behind the different components of the problem. Yes, yeah, we've definitely got a feeling for the emotion, haven't we? Yeah. I would wonder also, though, whether there was a little bit more detail needed. I mean, certainly in terms of a rich picture, I would say that two of those issues are quite clear to me. The efficiency of the current system is in question. The level of integration with other systems is of concern. What is it about the customer experience that is the concern? We can guess that because we can see that the customers are unhappy, that they feel that they're receiving a poor customer experience. But I might say that would be an area where we might be able to add a bit more detail. We might also be able to put in some speech bubbles to get some of the nuances of why people are unhappy there. Another point that I should probably make, and this is a good example with which to make it, is that yeah, okay, sorry, I'm getting distracted by what's in the chat. Yeah, so more wording is needed. You're picking up on the same sorts of things that I am here. You are saying that, yes, it shows a clear structure. We didn't mention where the problem started from. That's a good point, yeah, and think about how you could more clearly indicate the starting point of some of these flows. So I think this sort of represents the idea that at the outset, as we're first trying to understand this, it's a good starting point. But there may be a point at which we need more detail. So if we were actually going to be undertaking a redesign, we would want a lot more detail, and we might build a further rich picture. So there might be a further iteration of this to really focus upon the experience of some of these people and exactly what is needing to be integrated. We don't at this stage know what these other two systems are doing, what they need to interact effectively with the CRM. Okay, so we've got the idea here that we may need different pictures for different groups of stakeholders. Yes, you can almost jigsaw things together to say, okay, can we get a picture of what's happening for the sales team, what's happening for the marketing team? If you put those two together and then try and understand how the links are working or not working, that can be a very interesting dialogue, and it can really surface some of the detail of what you're trying to deal with there. Yeah. So I'm conscious I don't think I've gone through everybody's comments, but I hope I've picked up on enough that we can sort of flesh out our understanding of how we can start with an initial rich picture, we can refine it, and we might build upon it at different stages of the intervention to do different things. Right, so stepping over into the conceptual world then. The CATWO is another of the tools that's used within the soft systems methodology. It's used to help to define or to provide a definition of a system for which you're going to model the activity. However, in this context, we're simply going to use the CATWO to express a perspective on the purpose of the system. So this visual here comes from a book by Chetland and Poulter, which is a really good introductory text to soft systems methodology. It's not a very thick book. It's the sort of thing that you could, for example, read on a train journey to London, for example. So when we're looking at CATWO, we're looking at these different elements of the CATWO. So we've got the customers, the people who are affected by the transformation, the purposeful activity which is happening here. The purposeful activity is based upon a worldview or perspective that is held by the owners who own and design this transformation, and the actors that are delivering it. And this is all done in the context of environmental constraints. We say these are taken as given in doing the T, but it might be more helpful to think of them as, the environmental factors that you have to take into account as you manage this process? You know, what might cause you challenges, issues, obstacles? What might you have to take into account in some of the activities that you undertake? So I like to show that visual because it works for some people, and I think it gives this clear picture that the actors are delivering this transformation based upon the worldview. However, some of you might find it easier to engage with this representation, where we say, okay, who are the customers? Who are the beneficiaries or victims? The actors. Who's carrying out the activities? Transformation. What actually is the business activity? The worldview. What perspective is taken as to why that system is being operated, why that purpose is a good purpose, a desirable purpose. The owner is the person who owns or is accountable for the business system, and the environmental constraints is, the constraints in the external environment, the things that have to be dealt with. They're more readily understood when you've got examples. So let's move on to a first example. And because we are representing multiple stakeholder perspectives, this is, of course, the first example. So if we look, the customer's perspective on a new CRM for Algabar. They've identified the customers, the sales team, the customer services team, the marketing team. The actors, the people delivering, the IT team, the analytics team. What are they doing? They're building or buying a CRM system to improve customer experience because they believe that a better CRM system can improve customer experience. The owner is the CEO and the rest of the management team there. And the environmental constraints that they're considering the GDPR, the data protection. They're thinking about the ISO, the Consumer Protection Act, the IT policies that are in existence within the organization. Now, I have 3 of these. So I've got the customer's perspective, the IT team's perspective, and the management's perspective. And rather than have you look at those in detail, I should say right now that the bit that's different is the transformation and the worldview. Each of these perspectives shows the same customers, actors, owners, and environmental constraints. Now, it might be that you're a bit surprised about that. Maybe as you're working through an intervention, you might expect different groups of people to perceive different environmental constraints. But for the purposes of this example, let's go back and look in more detail then at these transformations and worldviews. So the customer's perspective is that they believe that their experience could be improved with a better CRM system. The IT's perspective, that the current CRM is poorly integrated. It causes them headaches. It could be better integrated if they were to build or buy a new system. And then the management's perspective. They feel that the costs of managing customers are too high, and they want to support automation and reduce costs. They believe that a new CRM system that would automate tasks and improve efficiency could help them to deliver this. So that's talking through the examples. Why is that in there? Okay. I put this in there because you can see that these relate back to the issues that were identified in the real world. Sorry about that. I couldn't think for a moment why I'd put that picture in again. So the issues that they've built their perspectives of the transformation and the worldview are based around these issues, their different desires in relation to those issues. And here then we have the different transformations and the different worldviews. So you can see that we're really looking at a group of people that are concerned with improving customer experience, improving integration, automating to improve efficiency. And that's quite interesting to me because on the rich picture, we have the management perspective related to the customer experience as well. And yet, when we come to the CATWO, the customer experience is appearing in the customer perspective, but it no longer appears to be something that the management is quite so concerned about. That can be quite interesting, you know, that there might be a sort of spiel about what is important, but sometimes when you come to model these things, actually, some of these things are perhaps perceived as less important than others. So as we look at these T's and W's here, actually, we have a bit of a dilemma, don't we? Because we could seek to build or buy a system that better integrates and improves the customer experience, or a system that better integrates and increases automation to reduce labour costs. But we could really question, is it really feasible to improve the customer experience and to reduce costs? So using these CATWOs to represent these different perspectives has brought us to an understanding of the challenge that we face here, that the different stakeholder groups might support to a greater or lesser extent improving customer experience versus increasing automation and reducing labour costs. Okay, so in this session then, we've investigated puzzles, problems and messes. We've looked at problem frames and considered what might make the formulation or solution of problems arguable. I've introduced problem structuring methods, and in the slide that I showed you earlier, we ran through the characteristics of problem structuring methods. But if you would look back at that slide again, you'll see that it contrasts the characteristics of these approaches with those that are more dominant in the OR analytics space. I would personally argue that where Rosenhead and Mingers portray these as the dominant and alternative paradigms, and I would say that, you know, back in 1989, that was perhaps reflecting the newness of PSMs. I think it's a shame that these days we don't more often think of them as complementary. The idea that we can use the alternative paradigm of PSMs to explore the space and to set us up in our dominant paradigm of more objective exploration of problems and solving of parts of those problems. We've then worked through examples. So we've looked quickly at PID's idiot questions. I definitely prefer the idea of wise men. You know, there aren't idiot questions, really. We don't want to perceive people as not being intelligent as they ask questions. We've also had a quick look at the rich pictures and the CATWO. Ultimately, though, I hope I've convinced you to think about whether problem formulation and problem solution are arguable. Because as PID says, one of the greatest mistakes that can be made when dealing with a mess is to carve off part of the mess, treat it as a problem, and then solve it as a puzzle. I have here some appendix detail on causal mapping. We'll have a go at causal mapping in the workshop, so you might want to take a look at these introductory slides in advance of that if you have the chance. Don't worry if you haven't the chance, because we will explain it to you. So here we are, a bit of the history where it's come from, different types of maps that you can build, and some examples. I think that's the end. Okay. And in relation to those examples, a little challenge relating back to the Algebra case study. So if when you have a look at those causal map approaches, you think, this really appeals to me, I feel really that I would like to have a go at these, you could have a go at building a causal map to explore the Algebra case. And you might try to develop a map that explores the goal of improving customer experience and reducing costs through automation, as was expressed in one of those CAPWO perspectives that we looked at. Okay. Finally then, I have references as usual. I wonder if I should pick out a few of those. Okay, so if I pick out this one up here, Checkland and Poulter, this one I think is a really good introductory text to SSM. You have Eden and Ackerman, the Making Strategy book. This is the journey, but I would also suggest that you look at some of their more recent academic publications, because the SODA journey making approach has gone through various iterations, and it's developing all the time in the way that it's used. The viable system model has become a lot more popular in recent years, and Angela Espinosa has a recent book about that. The fourth of those big PSMs that I talked about was developed by Friend and Hickling. So again, it's an older text, but the Friend and Hickling Planning Under Pressure book would tell you all about that one. Okay. So finally, thank you for listening. And, as usual, we have a quiz, but Francis has also asked me to plug the OR Society. So membership is free for students. So why wouldn't you join? You get a free quarterly newsletter, which may have tips on job hunting and careers advice, and how you might be able to access funding for research or for study. They do have a jobs board that can be particularly useful when you're looking for roles in the analytics sphere. They've got a lot of webinars and a virtual career week where you can get to meet some potential employers in this space. But I will return there to the week 3 quiz. I encourage you to have a go at that. It is contributing, of course, to your participation grades, and I'm hoping will reinforce some of the content that we've covered this week. Any questions? I think we're a little short on time, but any questions? I think we did have one earlier from Katerina about the what question. Question regarding the what. Should we think about it in terms of the final outcome? I would say yes. Yeah, use those questions to explore the situation in as many ways as you can. So yes, we've had the suggestion from PID. Let me read that out again. I don't want to go back in the slides. But we've had the suggestion from PID that we're asking what is going on and what do people want? That what do people want may be framed in terms of the final solution that they favour. So absolutely, you can use it as flexibly as you like. Do we have any other questions? How do you make sure that the rich picture does not become too complicated, I'm guessing? Yeah? How do you make... Yeah. So it's a challenge. And I would say that it is possible to almost use a template to try and place some of the elements as you draw it on the page. That can be helpful. But I would also say that you should be ready to redraw your rich pictures as they develop. Sometimes people draw them on whiteboards, and you can just move things around fairly easily so long as most of it is in the right place. Other times I see people use post-it notes. You can also, of course, do electronic versions as our Algebra version was. But I think I would point you to a bit of peer learning here that Millicent has suggested, that you might sometimes do different pictures for different groups of stakeholders, and maybe have different levels of detail on those different rich pictures. I would also point you to a source that I haven't referenced actually, by Monk and Howard. They talk a lot about how much structure and how much process to put on, suggesting that you should put on just sufficient to express what you want to express there. So it could be that thinking about, just exactly how much structure and process you want to put on can help you determine the level of detail and help you keep control of how complicated it's getting. Of course, if you have issues that are hidden in the detail, my honest response would have to be you embrace that and perhaps you draw a rich picture of a particular area, zooming in on a particular part of the problem or issue. I don't see any more questions popping up there. So thank you very much. Apologies, I have overrun slightly, but I look forward to seeing some of you this afternoon and hope the rest of you enjoy your workshops with Francis tomorrow. Thank you.